Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this first of the discussion draft workshops for the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. My name is Brian Annis. I'm the Undersecretary at the State Transportation Agency. Before I get started, let me just recognize a few other people in the room. With me up here on the stage is Chad Edison. He's our Deputy Secretary for Transportation at the Transportation Agency. He's going to give most of this presentation. Let me introduce also a couple people from Caltrans. We have Gila Privy over here and Ezekiel Castro. They're both work closely on this program with the agency. And we also have Mitch Weiss, currently of the California Transportation Commission, but only of the last 2 weeks. He was at the Transportation Agency as we developed these changes with the draft guidelines. So again, welcome to the workshop today. We're going to go through the PowerPoint, which will probably take 10 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. As a review of the agenda today, we're going to start out with a brief review. Looking at many of the people here, I think most in the audience probably have some familiarity with the program, but we'll do a quick review of the baseline statutory requirements and also a review of the 2014-15 program, and that's, of course, was concluded in the project selection phase in June of this past year with 14 projects selected and $224 million allocated. Second, we'll delve a little bit into the recent statutory changes with Senate Bill 9, Senator Bell's bill, which the governor signed and makes some that legislation makes some modifications to the existing program that was established in 2014. We'll talk about the changes in the discussion draft guidelines for the 2016 program. And again, we'll end with discussion and question and answers. This is the last slide I'm going to cover before I hand it over to Chad. This is just a review of where the funding for this program comes from. This funding is part of the cap and trade auction proceeds programs, of which there are several in transportation and the Resource Agency and the Cal Environmental Agency, Environmental Protection Agency. So there's several programs. Of the proceeds from the cap and trade auctions, 60% of those proceeds are continuously appropriated. And what we're talking about here is 10%, which is the current level for the TIRCP, or the Transit Intercity Rail Capital Program. The other programs that receive continuous appropriation, what that is budget speak for these funds have been statutorily authorized on an ongoing basis at these levels. The second one here is the high-speed rail program, which receives 25% of cap and trade proceeds annually. The SGC is Strategic Growth Council. That's the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program administered by the Sustainable Growth Council, 20%. And at 5% is the LC TOP, or the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. And transit agencies are likely familiar with that program as well. That's a program that allocates funds by a formula share that's the same formula used for the State Transit Assistance Program that's been around for a long time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chad Edison.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome to all in the room as well as those who are watching this online. Thank you for taking your time to be here today. The objectives of the program, what I'm going to do here is go through an overview of the program, kind of walking through the major sections of the guidelines. Then we'll focus on the specific changes that have occurred, as well as some specific focus of these discussion draft guidelines. The objectives of the program are to modernize California's transit systems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, expand and improve transit service to increase ridership, integrate the rail services of the state's various rail operations, including integration with high-speed rail and improving transit safety. These are very similar to what you saw in the earlier round that we did last year, but some of the wording has been updated and clarified, which we'll focus on later. The applicants that are eligible for this program are public agencies, and those include both JPAs, as well as other transit agencies that operate or have planning responsibility for existing or planned regularly scheduled transit service. So the statute lays out intercity rail and associated feeder bus services, commuter rail service, commuter bus, and then bus, ferry, or rail transit service as the areas of jurisdiction that public agencies have jurisdiction over. In terms of projects, the most important thing to emphasize is that we need to demonstrate greenhouse gas reductions with every project that we fund. And so that's an essential element to every project. Our eligible project lists include, but are not limited to, rail capital projects, intercity, commuter, and urban rail projects that increase service levels, improve reliability, or decrease travel times, the integration projects among modes, as well as across regions, and then bus rapid transit, bus and ferry transit investments that increase ridership. So the emphasis here is really on things that increase ridership, things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Many projects do both. If you have questions about whether a project you see that's not listed here is eligible, please put that into our comments, which you can do online through TIRCP comments at dot.ca.gov, and we monitor that during the guidelines development process so that we can address issues and questions that agencies submit to that. So if you don't ask it today, please submit that to our online presence as well. Our evaluation criteria are called out in statute, and here's a summary of what those are. The primary criteria are reducing GHG emissions, increasing ridership, integration, and safety. And so those are really the emphasis of most of the rating that you get on these projects, and are essential to demonstrate how your project addresses most of these, if not all of them. On the evaluation criteria, we have a number of secondary criteria, and here we really have a long list of co-benefits that we're encouraging people to support with their projects. Many projects support more than one of these, so it's good to demonstrate what your project is doing in addition to achieving the primary criteria. Reducing VMT and auto trips, a lot of that goes with the increase of ridership. Promotion of housing and employment, expanding rail and transit systems, enhancing connectivity. Many of these things revisit things that are emphasized in our primary objectives as well. The air quality impacts other than GHG emissions reduction. Some of these projects will do a lot for the air quality that can improve public health, the particulate matters reductions, and so forth. And we would encourage you to highlight that if your project achieves those. On the secondary criteria, we're also looking at disadvantaged community benefits, geographic equity, consistency with regional plans, the leverage of other funding sources for the project, in integration across modes. In terms of project selection, we look both at how the criteria are met as well as some of the risks involved in the project. We're looking for really good documentation on how you get to your greenhouse gas and ridership benefits. The documentation, we're going to try to be very clear in our call for projects and in our guidelines as to what we're looking for there. In terms of data that comes from regional models, that's one of the things that we are looking for a lot of backup material on. And so I think if one thing were to change from last time to this time, that kind of quality of the backup documentation needs to be enhanced, and we'll be trying to address that in both our guidelines and our call for projects. We also are looking for assurance that the project can move forward. So the agreements that need to be in place with key partners, the investments in the project. We do have some mechanisms for kind of lining the project up for that final installment of federal funds, for example, in a New Starts or other kind of competitive program. But in general, we're looking for, high level of certainty that the project's going to move forward when it comes into us. We're looking at the leveraging, as I mentioned earlier, as well. In 2015, we selected 14 projects, as Brian mentioned earlier. Those totaled $224 million of this program's funds, matched with funding on many of the projects from the local agencies using either regional resources or local funding sources or even other federal and state sources. I won't go through each of these projects, but the basic selection decision and what it was based on is listed in a short summary that we posted on each project, and that's on our website, the CalSTA website. If you go to the newsroom and you look under the cap and trade auction proceeds programs, we have all the documents of our program listed there. Senate Bill 9 made a number of clarifications and changes to our program. Many of these were already addressed in one way or another in our guidelines, and then others were changes to the program rather than just clarifications. It specifically says that the funding from this program will fund transformative capital improvements, and then puts a definition around what that is. It says that they will significantly reduce VMT, congestion, and GHG emissions by at least one of each of these three things: creating a new transit system, increasing the capacity of an existing transit system, or significantly increasing the ridership of a transit system. And then it also takes out the reference to operational projects. Although in the project elements that you'll see there are a few things that involve kind of deep planning, that involves a change in service that are permissible under the program. The bill also confirms eligibility for bus and ferry transit kind of throughout the program, and so you'll see that in much of the wording that has changed. It requires the approval of a multi-year program of projects, and then lays out two timelines for that, which I'll get into in a moment. The eligible projects have expanded to include, as an example, infrastructure access payments to host railroads. This is an element that allows purchase of capacity and access without necessarily a targeted set of capital investments being directly funded. And so this is another way to get especially commuter rail and intercity rail on shared corridors moving forward. In project evaluation, it specifically lists a number of things and adds them to our list of things to consider. The extent to which a project reduces GHG emissions, we were doing that already, but it's pulled in specific language to the evaluation section. Adds to the list of co-benefits, projects that support an SCS through enhancing the connectivity, integration, and coordination of the state's various transit systems. It doesn't just limit that to rail in some of the ways that it did before. Supplemental funding from non-state sources is highlighted, increase in transit ridership. These are all things that are specifically pulled out in the bill. It also clarifies that an applicant may submit an application to fund a project over multiple fiscal years. Again, many of the projects we adopted in our first list did this already, but we now have the specific direction and statute to do that. And then it says that by July 1st of 2018, we will approve a 5-year program of projects, starting with the funds from fiscal year 18-19 and going forward. It also says the grantee may apply to the CTC for a letter of no prejudice to allow the agency to expend its own money in advance of an allocation. So as we worked this through in the discussion draft, we published this in a way where you can see in yellow in kind of track changes type mode the major changes, the changes that we put into the language, and we'll take some of that tracking out of the final discussion draft, or the final draft that we publish in December, but just so you can see what we're changing from the baseline program, from the draft last year, from the guidelines last year. We tried to do that in a mode that would be easy to track. And we made conforming amendments to the guidelines for SB 9. We listed in the calendar about 2 weeks after the call for projects, a week where we will be in various places around the state, hosting optional meetings where you can discuss what you're considering for your application, and we'll publish more details on that before we get to those. But the idea there is to give agencies a chance to both talk about how their project matches up with the program, and also look at the increase, how to do the ridership modeling side of this, or the GHG reduction side of this. So we want to give folks a chance to ask clarifying questions on the guidelines and on the call for projects before they get all the way up to their application submission date. We will be, the discussion draft has new funding, suggested new funding options. Some of the projects that align with the program, including smartphone mobile ticketing, rail infrastructure access payments, transit effectiveness studies that are also asking for investments that will implement the results of those studies. Encouragement to coordinate with other greenhouse gas reduction programs. And We know the timing of these are sometimes different, but looking for ways to coordinate as best you can with those other programs. We also included in our discussion draft increased transparency of kind of the application process. We're requiring agencies to post the successful applications on their websites. And we will be giving more detailed feedback on the ratings we assign to the various evaluation criteria as part of our selection process. We also are asking for increased detail on benefits to disadvantaged communities, including some documentation of efforts to mitigate or avoid displacement, and consistent with the Air Board funding guidelines, the CARB funding guidelines. We'll ask for reporting to be quarterly. Coming up, we have a number of dates. So today is our first of these informal workshops in the discussion draft. We have our draft guidelines are planned to be released on December 18th. We have a 30-day review requirement on those guidelines. And then on the 19th, 20th, and 21st, we'll have a set of workshops both in Northern and Southern California, and then at the CTC meeting that will be the last chance to provide that input to the guidelines before they are finalized on February 4th with a call for projects planned for February 5th. We'll have the consultation opportunity that we talked about. We'll give more details on that later, but on the 22nd to 26th of February, applications due. Right now we're expecting around April 5th, and we're going to take a little bit more review time this next time around, given the larger number of applications we expect to receive, with an August 1st goal for publishing our list of approved projects. One other thing that changed in this set of guidelines is that we didn't put a specific cap on the number of projects that agencies could submit, and we also didn't put a specific maximum funding amount in there either. So those are some things that are pretty significant changes that you can submit comments on if you'd like to or ask questions about. So that's the quick overview, and at this point I'd like to open it up here for questions. And for those who are watching online, just a reminder that you can submit comments to tircp.comments@dot.ca.gov, and that is another way to get your comments to us. Sooner is better than later, given that we're trying to get to a final draft by December 18th. We'd like as much time as possible to reflect your comments in the preparation of that draft, and if they come in right at the last minute, they may get addressed before we get to final if you've submitted them. So thank you very much, and now it's open for questions, and Brian and I and Mitch, if needed, will do our best to address those questions. Anybody? And there is a microphone that I think Easy has that he'll be taking around if you do want to ask a question. Since this is a recorded session, it's best if you wait for the microphone to come to you before you ask the question. Jim.
Hello, Jim Allison with Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority. A couple questions more on the air quality side of things. Last time there was the use of MFAC 2011 data. Is that going to be updated to 2014 data, or is that in discussion with CARB at this time?
I will actually ask maybe CARB, if it's sitting in the back there. Do you guys know if is there a specific plan there? Is that something we'll be addressing as we develop the QM and the quantification methods? Okay, so for those who didn't hear the answer to the question, I believe that Carrie Anderson from CARB was saying that they plan to transition to the MFAC 2014 data for that. Okay. In this coming program.
Okay, thank you very much. I had one other question. I was going to encourage CalSTA and CARB to look at total emissions for projects, including life cycle costs for projects. A specific instance of that would be looking at uses of alternative fuels that have lower overall carbon life cycle content, and allow those to be included in the calculations. Specifically, renewable diesel is the element that we're thinking of at this time.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll do our best to try to address that. Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, Christina Watson, Transportation Agency for Monterey County. Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you just fine.
Okay. Just curious about the whether or not it would be possible to get an idea in the guidelines or in the application format of what the range is that you're looking for a successful application, because this first time around we were all kind of fumbling in the dark and putting our numbers together, but for the next round it would be nice to know early on if we should even bother to move forward with an application or if we wouldn't qualify with our greenhouse gas reduction numbers. And along those same lines, the scoring it would be nice to have sort of a scoring criterion for the application process for the same way, so we can know if we're scoring low or high on various criteria. And I did want to ask about the multi-year programming. So I do have an actual question, not just comments.
Yes.
And that is, so once you start doing the 5-year programming, is that going to be that applicants need to get their applications in at the beginning of the 5-year cycle, and then you're programming 5 years based on those?
Yeah, well, to be specific about, that's one that I can address right now. In our guidelines, we talk about the program that we're getting ready to do now, which is the program that would be for the next 2 fiscal years plus the residual funds from from this current fiscal year. So we will have a program that's the 16-17 funding, the 17-18 funding, and whatever balance is accrues to the program from the 15-16 auctions, uncommitted funds. And that will be initially addressed, after the governor's budget is released and maybe updated prior to our selection of applications, depending on what happens with the overall funding for those, for the program and for those specific fiscal years. The second kind of opportunity that we're envisioning right now is that 5-year programming that needs to be completed with selections made by July 1st of 2018. So we envision a bit longer guidelines development process and a bit longer on the application cycle from the time the call for projects is released to the time selections are made for that 5-year round. And that will be allocating funds starting with the 18-19 fiscal year all the way out through the 2022-2023 fiscal year, based on what the statute calls on us to do. So the statute also says that after that, every 2 years, there will be an additional programming. It will be done by, I believe, I don't have it right in front of me, but I think it's April 15th, if I remember correctly. So we can look that up with the statute, just to be sure. But it's a little bit earlier than that, June 30th, July 1st kind of time frame that we have for the first 5-year program. So that would address uncommitted funds, balances that have built that were not included in the original 5-year estimate, as well as the addition of more years to the program. So I think that the transition here is starting to look something more like the STIP process once you get to that after you get to that first 5-year program. It's a good question. Other questions? Yes. Let's get a microphone.
Thanks. Jeff Damon, Sacramento Regional Transit. So following up on the question about the 5-year program, as I understand it, then 2 years after that, then those projects that are selected would be 5 years out after that. Are you guys envisioning there's any opportunity that if a project's not ready or it's delayed or something that projects can be advanced, similar to the STIP that sometimes projects do get advanced if something's been prioritized isn't ready to go?
Mitch can jump into on this one, but yeah, that is the idea, that you'd have that kind of flexibility in a couple ways. So when you get to the 5-year program, some projects would be programmed presumably in the 18-19 year, and those could receive their allocation and go forward. If one is programmed later, say 21-22, that would have the opportunity perhaps to avail itself of that letter of no prejudice process if there's some local funds to use in advance of receiving that funding from this program. But as well, if there's, like we do see in the STIP, if there's programs that slip a year, there's opportunity to advance others. And as part of that every 2-year cycle, you can make adjustments as well to account for project readiness and so forth.
Great, thanks.
Given that this is a competitive program, we wouldn't envision kind of substituting other projects for the ones that were selected, but I think those kinds of adjustments that Brian just talked about would be clearly possible. It's also another thing that is allowed under our program are contingent funding, in particular for projects that are getting ready to go in for a new starts or other equivalent major federal funding commitment. And our program is set up to allow us to make a contingent commitment to those projects that expires by the next time we do our programming, or so that there's an expectation that you will receive your federal commitment, and if that doesn't materialize, you can't spend money from the program. So the ability to do that, especially in these longer-term funding commitments, we think will help projects advance and go after that final commitment of federal funds. Yes, Jim.
One other comment. Jim Allison again with CCJPA. Wanted to seek, or at least make a comment about the use of MPO specific or trip length specific or trip generation specific lengths for specific transit projects, because I don't think there's a universally applicable trip length or occupancy length, occupancy for different transit vehicles. So I wanted to ensure that that locally but defended and documented data can be used in those calculations.
Okay, we'll definitely make note of that, and we'll be talking in our conversation with CARB, we'll be trying to address some of these comments on the way that the quantification gets developed. So thank you. Please submit, if you have additional comments on any of these topics that come up after the meeting, please submit them to our comment box as well.
Okay,
Yes.
Jeff Damon again, Sacramento Regional Transit. One of your slides talked about clean vehicles, and I was just curious if you could expand on what you were thinking in terms of clean vehicles. It was early on in your presentation.
Well, I think if you, that's one of the secondary type benefits, and it's a feature of a number of the projects that we funded this last time around. So you'll notice that many of the projects that came in were looking, like Antelope Valley had a major investment in zero emission vehicles that was part of achieving their GHG benefits. So I think that's an example of the type of project that we could fund. Also in Monterey, in Monterey area, they funded both a relocation of a maintenance facility and an addition of a zero emission vehicle to their fleet for service to a disadvantaged community. So some of those types of investments, clearly we're looking for anything that helps achieve that reduced GHG benefits, and that's one of the ways to do that.
So follow-up, would that be, say, electric bus and charging station type of projects?
Could include that as well, yes. So I mean, it's both the infrastructure and support of it as well as the vehicles themselves.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the kind of innovative things that we saw in the first round was taking the operating savings from an investment. In the case of Monterey Salinas Transit, this was an example in their project. They took the operating savings they would achieve from less deadhead when they expanded a facility closer to where their service was, and they actually reinvested that in new service to a disadvantaged community using a zero emission vehicle. So that just gives an example of, they banked some of the labor and fuel savings they got from the facility relocation and use that towards funding the operating side of service, which they also were putting capital into in the form of a zero emission bus.
Christina Watson again. Is it on? Okay. With the Transportation Agency for Monterey County, and I appreciate Senator Bell's thoughtfulness in terms of allowing CalSTA to coordinate a statewide agreement with the host railroads, because that's one of the biggest hurdles statewide for new services and emerging corridors in particular. And I'm curious if you have any sort of idea of what percentage of the program is going to be set aside for that work.
We don't have specific program set-asides right now in our guidelines, and you guys are welcome to suggest that we do that. But right now our guidelines don't include a specific commitment to different types of investments. Partly depends on what comes in and how competitive the projects are.
I was going to suggest a few things to see if anyone wanted to comment on a few other issues, and some of these were raised in the PowerPoint. We are trying, as the PowerPoint indicated, to figure out how we can coordinate with the other cap and trade proceeds programs. There's, in the transit area, for example, you really have two others. You have the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program and the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program. So what's suggested as the mechanism here in the guidelines is that in applying for a grant here, you could come in perhaps with a bigger project that depends on getting a grant in one of those other programs. But at the same time, the project has separable elements. So if you were not successful in getting that other grant from the other cap and trade program, you could go forward with a downscaled project with the Transit Intercity Rail Capital Program. So that's a concept that we suggest here to get feedback on. I think the other cap and trade programs are thinking about this as well. The Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, trying to figure out how they can best coordinate across even a wider variety outside of transit of funding programs. So certainly if you had any thoughts on that, that's appreciated. As Chad mentioned, we don't in this one have a funding cap. Last round, we suggested no more than a third of funds could go to any particular project. We maintain our geographic diversity requirement for the program. So that would still be considered, and probably at some level put a bit of a cap on what any one project could get. But that's something that we thought we would leave off this draft guidelines and see if there were comments on that idea of not specifying any particular cap of how much a project could get. And the last one is just this transparency element. We're suggesting in the guidelines here that successful applicants do go ahead upon award and post the full application. We did in putting out the 2015 round, list attributes of successful projects with some detail in different areas. For example, the ridership benefits, the greenhouse gas benefits, the benefits to disadvantaged communities. So we're looking at making that a little bit more robust. But again, if anyone had other specific ideas they wanted to bring forward on that, would be interested in those as well. So I'll throw those out there in case that inspires any thought today. If not, again, as Chad mentioned, we're happy to receive comments from the website, TIRCP comments at dot.ca.gov. So Ezekiel's over here with the mic if there are any other questions.
Yeah, I had a question about the new category of eligible projects for smartphone mobile ticketing, other software hardware solutions to reduce ticketing transaction costs, and then the transit effectiveness or operational studies. Are those, well, the first question is, are those going to have different scoring criteria than the capital projects? Are they going to be looked at differently than the capital projects? And then was also interested in getting a sense of, for the transit effectiveness and operational studies, if you could talk more about where that's coming from or what types of things you might have in mind or might want to be seeing from that.
Okay, so I'll take on the second one first and then go back to the ticketing one. The transit effectiveness studies, the observation there is that many of these studies and plans that agencies put forward have implementation related to them that leads to specific ridership increases on the systems. And so the encouragement here is to link both the actual effort to identify what those priorities are and the implementation, which could include additional service or other kinds of investments, to each other and to ensure that that benefit is actually achieved. So we're looking at this as an area of potentially low-cost benefits that can be achieved through a relatively small upfront investment in identifying the priorities and then linked to a service increase or other action that locks in that increased ridership as a result of completing that work. So it's important that we have the guarantee of greenhouse gas emission savings, but that's the focus of that effort. On the On the other project types, I mean, the projects are weighed against the same primary evaluation criteria. There are, we do call out specifically the ability to compare like projects with each other, as well as to look within regions at the variety of projects that are within that geographic region in terms of picking the priorities. So we're not necessarily just ranking the projects statewide and saying at the end of it, if that leads to not having geographic equity, we wouldn't make that kind of selection. So there is some consideration of both the project type as well as the geography of that project in the selection process. These investments are encouraged to be across multiple operators, as you've seen, so as much as possible, extending the benefits or showing that they are expandable or have leverage, if applied to a broader geography, is something that we identify in a number of our projects. One thing that I would call out in our Section 7 of our draft guidelines, when we were talking about submitting multiple projects and submitting projects to us, one of the things that we highlight there is the need to prioritize the projects within an agency, as well as identifying phases or priorities within each project application if available resources don't allow the full project to be funded. We're looking for, so like a high dollar, as we say in here, a high dollar single application with no scalability or separable project elements may increase the risk of being uncompetitive in the overall process. So we had a number of occasions where we were able to fund some of the project, but not the whole project, given the funding we had available. And that's something that we would suggest would continue in the future in order to get to a good geographic mix of projects. So. If there's no other questions, I think we'll stick around for informal conversation after this. For those online, thank you for watching what we've done today. If you have questions, again, please submit them to tircp.comments@dot.ca.gov. That information's also on the workshop announcement. So thank you very much for all your time, and have a good day.